The sun hammered down on the spine of the New Mexico territory with the weight of judgment, baking the red earth until it cracked like an old man's heel. It was the late 1870s, a time when the world seemed to be holding its breath between the savage past and a future that smelled of coal smoke and iron. Dust Creek was not much of a town, just a collection of timber and hope huddled together against the vast, indifferent horizon. The main street was a wide scar of dirt that turned to thick mud when it rained and choking red powder when it did not. On this particular morning, the dust lay heavy on the porch railings. 3 miles to the east, the Union Pacific whistle screamed, a lonely, mechanical wail that echoed off the canyon walls, reminding everyone in Dust Creek that civilization was coming, whether they wanted it or not. A herd of longhorns was being driven through the lower valley, their lowing sounding like a distant thunderstorm. Lillian Hart sat by the window of her shop, Hart stitching in schoolroom, watching the heat waves shimmy off the ground. The sign above her door was fading, the black paint peeling to reveal the gray wood beneath, much like Lillian herself felt some days. She was a woman of 26 years, though her eyes held the weary caution of someone twice that age. She wore a dress of high-collared gray calico, buttoned to the chin, her dark hair pulled back so severely that it pulled at her temples. It was armor. Everything about Lillian Hart was armor. She pushed a needle through a piece of tough denim, the rhythm of her hand steady and practiced. Inside the shop, the air smelled of dry cotton, chalk dust, and the faint, lingering scent of lavender she used to keep the moths away. It was a clean smell, a disciplined smell. It was nothing like the scent of whiskey and stale tobacco that used to cling to her husband's coat. The memory of him came unbidden, as it often did when the town was quiet. He had been a deputy marshal, a man who wore a badge to legitimize his cruelty. He had been handsome in a sharp, dangerous way, the kind of man who could charm a woman into marriage and then gamble away her dowry in a single night. He had died 2 years ago in a shootout near the border, leaving Lillian with nothing but a pile of debts and a profound, aching relief that she had been too ashamed to admit to the priest. She felt soiled by her marriage. In the eyes of the town, she was the respectable widow Hart, but in her own mirror, she saw a woman who had allowed herself to be owned by a monster. She had learned to make herself small, to be useful but invisible. She sewed shirts for the miners and dresses for the saloon girls, though she never delivered them personally to the back door of the saloon and 3 days a week. She taught reading and arithmetic to the few children whose parents saw the value in it. Out on the street, the doors of the Golden Nugget Saloon swung open, and the tinny sound of a piano spilled out. It was a cheerful, bawdy tune, completely at odds with the silence of Lillian's life. She tightened her grip on the needle. She did not need music. She needed an order. She needed the safety of her 4 walls. "Morning, Mrs. Hart." Lillian did not jump, though her heart gave a traitorous little kick. She looked up to see Ezra Crowell standing in her open doorway. He was a man in his 50s who wore his ambition like a brightly colored vest. He was dressed better than anyone else in Dust Creek, in a suit that had been brushed free of dust, and he smelled of expensive bay rum hair tonic. "Mr. Crowell," Lillian said, her voice cool and level. She did not rise from her chair. "If you are here about the shirts, they will not be ready until Tuesday." Crowell stepped inside, his eyes sweeping over the modest shop with a look that was half appraisal, half contempt. "A man can wait for a shirt, Lillian, but opportunity waits for no one." He leaned against the counter, invading her space with his casual confidence. He was buying up land. Everyone knew it. He had purchased the old Miller farm, the burned-out lot behind the livery stable, and now he was eyeing the stretch of buildings that included her shop. "I have told you, Mr. Crowell," Lillian said, turning her attention back to her sewing. "The shop is not for sale. I have my living to make, and the children have nowhere else to learn." "The children," Crowell scoffed lightly. "Half of them will be running cattle by the time they are 12. And as for your living, surely a woman like you, still young, still presentable, finds this life lonely. If you sold, you could move to Santa Fe, start fresh, find a new husband." Lillian's needle paused. I have had a husband. Mr. Crowell. I find the condition overrated. Crowell chuckled, a dry sound like dry leaves skittering on stone. You are a hard woman, Mrs. Hart. But change is coming. Big things. The railroad is expanding its spur. This town is going to be a hub. Dust Creek will not be a place for schoolrooms and seamstresses much longer. It will be a place for commerce. He placed a hand on the counter, his fingers drumming a rhythm. Think about it. My offer stands, but prices go down when a man loses his patience. He tipped his hat and walked out, leaving the door open. Lillian stared after him, a chill running down her spine despite the heat. She knew men like Crowell. They were wolves who learned to walk on two legs. She stood up and walked to the door, closing it firmly, turning the lock with a sharp click. 5 miles west of Dust Creek, the world changed. The scrubby flats gave way to the rising swell of the foothills, where the earth folded in on itself to create the White Elk Valley. It was a place of stunning violence and beauty, where the red rocks jutted up like the bones of the earth and the river cut a green vein through the dry land. Kai Redhawk sat atop his horse on a ridge overlooking the valley entrance. He was a man of 30 years, his face weathered by sun and wind into a map of hard choices. His hair was black as a raven's wing, tied back with a strip of leather, and his eyes were the color of dark obsidian. He wore the buckskin trousers of his people, but over his chest was a faded blue Army Scout's jacket, stripped of its insignias. It was a contradiction, just like Kai himself. He watched a small herd of buffalo grazing in the distance, mere shadows of the great thundering rivers of beast that had once covered these plains. His heart ached with a familiar, dull throb. He had been a warrior once. He had painted his face and ridden against the bluecoats, screaming his defiance to the sky. But defiance did not feed empty bellies. Defiance did not stop the winter sickness. Now, he worked for the very men he had fought. He tracked lost cattle for the ranchers, broke horses for the cavalry, and served as a scout when the army moved through the territory. He took their silver dollars and bought flour and blankets for the elders who shivered in the reservation camp north of the valley. Every coin felt heavy in his pocket, a weight of shame. He was a survivor, but in the eyes of the young warriors who still dreamed of glory, he was something close to a traitor. "Papa, look!" The voice was high and clear, like a bird calling in the canyon. Kai looked down. Juniper was sitting near the riverbank, her small hands busy with a pile of smooth river stones. She was 7 years old, a creature of light and air. Her skin was the color of wild honey, lighter than his, and her eyes were a startling, vibrant hazel, the legacy of her mother. Kai's wife, Sarah, had been a white woman captured in a raid when she was a child, raised by the tribe, and loved by Kai with a ferocity that had terrified him. She had died 3 years ago of a fever that no medicine man and no army doctor could break. She had left him with Juniper, a child who belonged to two worlds and was welcome in neither. "I see, little bird," Kai called down, his voice softening in a way it never did for anyone else. "You have built a fortress." "It is a castle," Juniper corrected him, standing up and brushing the sand from her knees. She wore a dress made of deerskin, but she had braided a blue ribbon into her hair, a trinket he had bought her in town. "Grandmother says the spirits live in the stones." "Grandmother is wise," Kai said, urging his horse down the slope. But as he rode, his eyes caught something that made his stomach turn. Near the edge of the tree line, a fresh stake had been driven into the ground. It was a piece of milled lumber, alien to this landscape, with a strip of red cloth tied to the top. Surveyors. Kai dismounted and walked to the stake. He crouched down, touching the wood. It was the mark of the railroad, or perhaps the land speculators. They were pushing closer. The treaty lines were drawn on paper in Washington, but out here, lines were drawn with wooden stakes and barbed wire. If they took the White Elk Valley, they took the water. Without the river, the tribe's winter camp would be a graveyard. A twig snapped behind him. Kai spun around, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt. It was Black Moon, an older warrior, watching him from the shadows of a pine tree. Black Moon's face was grim. You see it, Red Hawk? Black Moon said in their tongue. The spider weaves its web. It is just one stake, Kai said, though he did not believe it. I saw them, Black Moon spat. 3 men with brass instruments. They measured the earth as if they were cutting up a deer carcass. One of them spoke of Crowell. He said the man with the silver tongue has bought the paper for this land. Ezra Crowell. The name tasted like ash in Kai's mouth. He knew the man. He had seen him in town, watching the Indians with eyes that saw only obstacles to be removed. They cannot take the valley, Kai said quietly. It is protected by the Treaty of 68, Black Moon laughed, a harsh, barking sound. Paper protects nothing. Only blood protects land. You wear their coat, Red Hawk. Do you think it will save you when they come for the water? Kai looked at Juniper, who was now singing a song in English, a lullaby her mother had taught her. She was spinning in circles, arms wide, embracing the world. I do what I must to keep us alive, Kai said. Alive is not the same as living. Black Moon turned and vanished back into the trees, leaving Kai alone with the stake and the red flag flapping lazily in the wind. 2 days later, the air in Dust Creek was thick enough to chew. A sandstorm had blown through the night before, leaving everything coated in a fine layer of grit. It crunched between teeth and settled into the seams of clothes. In the back of Lillian's shop, 5 children sat on wooden benches, scratching slate pencils across small chalkboards. Lillian moved among them, correcting their letters. She was a good teacher, patient and firm, though she never hugged the children, never let them see her softness. Softness was a weakness. Keep your spine straight, Thomas, she murmured to a boy with messy hair. A crooked back leads to crooked thoughts. The door opened, and a gust of wind rang the little bell. It was not a customer, but Martha Higgins, a widow who lived 3 doors down. Martha was a round, cheerful woman who seemed determined to drag Lillian back into the land of the living, mostly through gossip and unwanted advice. Lillian, have you heard? Martha whispered loudly, though the children were right there. The cavalry is coming through today. B Company. They say there has been trouble up near the ridge. There is always trouble near the ridge, Lillian said, not looking up from Thomas's slate. Usually caused by men looking for it. Martha leaned against the fabric bolts. Well, you ought to close up early. Watch the parade, a woman alone. You could do with seeing some strapping men in uniform. God knows you need a husband. Lillian, it is not natural. A pretty woman like you fading away in this gloom. You need a big, strong man to keep the wind out at night. Lillian's hand froze. The image of her late husband flashed in her mind, his heavy hand. The smell of his sweat. The fear that paralyzed her when the wind howled because it meant he couldn't go out and would be home, drinking. I do not need a husband. Martha, Lillian said, her voice sharp enough to cut the thread. She turned, her eyes flashing with a rare fire. I need silence. I need to pay my rent. And I need Thomas to learn his vowels. I do not need a man to clutter up my peace. Martha blinked, taken aback. I only meant... I know what you meant, Lillian said, softening slightly, though her posture remained rigid. But I am done with that life. Please. Martha sighed, patting her arm. You are too young to be so old. Lillian Hart? The bell rang again as Martha left. Lillian dismissed the children shortly after, her head pounding. She walked to the window. The street was busy. People were gathering. The talk in the general store earlier had been ugly. Men were saying that the Indians had slaughtered a cow belonging to the Crowell herd. They were saying it was time the army taught the Redskins a lesson. Lillian rubbed her temples. She tried to ignore the politics of the territory. It was a man's world, violent and loud. She just wanted to survive it. But as she stood there, she saw Ezra Crowell standing on the boardwalk opposite her shop. He was talking to a man in a dusty travel coat, a representative from the railroad company. Lillian's window was open to catch the breeze, and Crowell's voice carried, White Elk Valley is the key, Crowell was saying, gesturing vaguely toward the west. You get me the troops to clear the obstruction, and I will hand you the right-of-way on a silver platter. The savages are just squatters. White Elk Valley. Lillian whispered the name. She did not know where it was exactly, only that it lay to the west, where the sunsets were blood red. Why did that name make her shiver? A trumpet sounded in the distance. The cavalry. The ground began to vibrate. The citizens of Dust Creek lined the boardwalks. Lillian stayed behind the glass of her shop window. Safe, separated. The column rode in. Dust billowed around the horses' hooves. Blue uniforms, dusty and sweat-stained. Yellow neckerchiefs dull with grime. The soldiers looked tired. They were not the gallant heroes Martha fantasized about. They were men doing a job, hard and unsmiling. But it was not the soldiers that caught Lillian's eye. At the front of the column, riding alongside the captain, was a scout. He did not wear a uniform, but a buckskin vest over a faded army jacket. He rode a paint horse with a fluid grace that made him look like he was part of the animal. His hair was long and dark, his profile sharp and noble, carved from ancient stone, and sitting in front of him on the saddle, nestled securely between his arms, was a child. It was a little girl with wild hair and skin like honey. She was clinging to the man's chest, her face buried in his coat, as if the town were a monster she could not bear to look at. The man, Kai Redhawk, looked straight ahead. He ignored the jeers from the men outside the saloon. He ignored the spitting. He ignored the way the women pulled their skirts back. His face was a mask of stoic indifference. But Lillian, safe behind her glass, saw his hands. His large, brown hands were wrapped around the child, protective, fierce, and incredibly gentle. Lillian felt a strange lurch in her chest, a physical sensation of breathlessness. She had seen men hold guns, bottles, cards, and whips. She had rarely seen a man hold a child as if she were the most precious thing in the world. The scout turned his head. For a fleeting second, his dark eyes swept across the street and locked onto Lillian's window. It was a gaze that stripped away the dusty glass and the gray dress. It was intense, sorrowful, and penetrating. Lillian stepped back into the shadows of her shop, her hand flying to her throat. The column passed, the dust settled, but the image remained burned into her mind. The warrior and the child, the loneliness in his eyes that mirrored her own. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rattling the sign above her door. A storm was coming. Not just the sand and the wind, but something human, something dangerous. And for the first time in years, Lillian Hart felt the terrified, exhilarating beat of her own heart. Ezra Crowell watched the scout pass from the balcony of the hotel, lighting a cigar with slow deliberation. He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Enjoy your ride, Red Hawk," he murmured to the smoke. "It will be your last one as a free man." The sun dipped lower, casting long, distorted shadows across Dust Creek. The stage was set. The players were in motion. And in the silence of her shop, Lillian Hart picked up her needle, but her hands were trembling too much to sew. The morning in Dust Creek broke not with the rooster's crow, but with the frantic shouting of men and the squeal of iron axles turning too fast. The sun was barely a thumb's width above the horizon when the news hit the main street like a bucket of cold water. One of Ezra Crowell's supply wagons had been ambushed 5 miles east, near the Painted Rock Formation. Smoke was still rising and thin, gray tendrils against the pale blue sky. By the time the driver, a man named Pete with a bloody bandage around his head, stumbled into the Golden Nugget Saloon, half the town was awake and listening. The rumors flew faster than the dust devils. Some said it was a bandit gang from the south. Others, louder and more insistent, claimed it was the Apache. Lillian Hart swept the boardwalk in front of her shop, her movements mechanical. She kept her eyes lowered, but her ears were sharp. She could hear Ezra Crowell's voice booming from the steps of the sheriff's office. "It is them. I tell you," Crowell shouted. His face flushed a deep, indignant red. He waved a hand toward the wilderness beyond the town limits. "The Red Hawk tribe. They are starving, and they are desperate. They took the flour, they took the ammunition, and they left a good man bleeding in the dirt. How long are we going to wait for the army to protect our property?" The crowd murmured in agreement. Fear was a dry tinder, and Crowell held the match. Lillian paused, leaning on her broom. She knew Pete, the driver. He was known to drink while he drove, and Painted Rock was notorious for loose gravel that could overturn a wagon without any help from arrows or bullets. Yet, looking at the faces of the men gathering around Crowell, she saw that the truth mattered far less than the anger. The town was struggling. The silver mine output had slowed, and the railway spur was taking too long. They needed someone to blame, and the people of the valley were an easy target. "We should ride out there," a young miner shouted, hefting a pickaxe handle. "Teach them a lesson before they come for our women." Lillian shivered, though the morning air was already warm. She turned to go back inside, wanting to shut out the ugliness, when a sound cut through the clamor. It was the thunder of hooves, fast and heavy. The crowd turned as one. A horse burst onto the main street, its coat slick with sweat and foam, galloping hard. The rider was not a bandit, nor a soldier. It was the scout. It was a Kai Redhawk. He pulled the reins hard, bringing the paint horse to a sliding stop in front of the general store, sending a cloud of red dust billowing over the angry mob. The silence that fell over the street was total and suffocating. Kai looked nothing like the stoic statue Lillian had seen leading the column days before. His chest was heaving. His hair had come loose from its leather tie, and his eyes were wide with a frantic, terrifying intensity. But it was what he held in front of him that made Lillian drop her broom. The little girl, Juniper, was slumped against his chest. Her face was the color of old parchment, draining of life. A makeshift tourniquet made from a strip of buckskin was tied tightly around her calf, but it had not stopped the bleeding. Dark, crimson blood soaked the girl's deerskin leggings and stained Kai's hands. "Doctor!" Kai's voice cracked like a whip, raw and desperate. He did not look at the guns that were instinctively leveled at him. He looked only at the faces, searching. "I need a doctor now." The men of Dust Creek stared back with hostility. To them, he was the enemy they had just been cursing. He was the savage who had supposedly raided the wagon. "Get out of here, Redhawk," a man near the saloon shouted, spitting on the ground. "We do not treat you kindly here." Kai's gaze hardened, shifting from desperation to a cold, lethal fury. "She is a child," he snarled. She stepped in a wolf trap, an iron jaw trap set on the ridge. Crowell stepped forward, his thumbs hooked in his vest, a smirk playing on his lips. He knew exactly whose traps those were. He had ordered them set along the boundary lines to cripple the tribe's hunting dogs. "The doctor is busy." Crowell lied smoothly. "And even if he were not, he does not work for free. Take her back to your witch doctors in the valley." Lillian watched from her doorway. She knew where Dr. Higgins was. He had been carried into the back room of the saloon 2 hours ago, singing bawdy songs until the whiskey took his legs. He would be useless until noon, perhaps longer. She looked at the child. Juniper's head rolled back slightly, her eyes fluttering. The blood was dripping steadily onto the dust, a metronome counting down the seconds of a life. Something inside. Lillian snapped. The fear that had ruled her life for 2 years, the fear that told her to be invisible, to be quiet, to be safe. It vanished under a sudden, hot surge of instinct. She remembered the nights during the war when she had bound her husband's wounds, the nights she had sat up with feverish neighbor children. She remembered that pain had no color and no politics. Lillian stepped off the boardwalk. Her boots crunched loudly on the gravel. "Bring her to me," she commanded. Her voice was not loud, but it carried across the silent street. Every head turned. Crowell looked at her with disbelief. Kai turned his horse, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Mrs. Hart," Crowell warned, his voice low and dangerous. "You do not want to involve yourself in this." Lillian ignored him. She ignored the murmurs of the church women who were watching from their windows. She walked straight up to the skittish horse, reaching out to grab the bridle. The animal snorted, smelling the blood, but Lillian held firm. "The doctor is drunk, and you know it," she said to Kai, her chin lifted. "I have clean water and bandages. Bring her inside, now." Kai hesitated for only a heartbeat. He saw the steel in this woman's spine. He nodded once, a sharp jerk of his chin, and slid from the saddle, cradling Juniper in his arms as if she were made of glass. "Make a hole," Lillian said to the crowd, her voice ringing with an authority she did not know she possessed. She turned and marched toward her shop. The crowd parted, stunned by her audacity. Kai followed close behind, his shadow falling over her, shielding her from the glare of the sun and the glare of the town. As they crossed the threshold into her shop, Lillian felt the heavy weight of the town's judgment settle on her shoulders. But she did not look back. She slammed the door and threw the bolt. "The table," Lillian said, sweeping bolts of fabric onto the floor without a second thought. "Lay her there." The air in the shop changed instantly. The smell of lavender and chalk was overpowered by the scent of copper blood, horse sweat, and the wood smoke that clung to Kai's skin. Kai laid Juniper on the sturdy oak cutting table. The girl whimpered, a high, thin sound that tore at Lillian's heart. "Hold her shoulders," Lillian ordered, rolling up her sleeves. "I need to cut the pant leg. This is going to hurt her." She hurried to the stove in the back, grabbing the kettle of water she always kept hot for tea, and poured it into a basin. She threw in a bar of lye soap and grabbed her sharpest sewing scissors. When she returned to the table, Kai was leaning over his daughter, whispering rapidly in his own tongue. His large hands pinned the girl's small shoulders to the wood, but his touch was agonizingly gentle. Lillian took a breath and began to work. The scissors sliced through the tough deer skin. The wound was ugly. The rusted teeth of the trap had torn deep into the muscle of the calf. It needed to be cleaned, and it needed to be stitched. "I am going to pour the water," Lillian said, looking up at Kai. "Do not let her move." Kai nodded. His face was inches from Lillian's as she leaned in. She could see the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the pores of his skin, the sharp angle of his jaw. He smelled of the open plains, of sagebrush and rain. It was a raw, masculine scent that made the small room feel suddenly very tight. Lillian poured the water. Juniper screamed. It was a terrible, shattering sound. The girl thrashed, her back arching off the table. Kai held her down, murmuring, "Shh, little bird, shh, breathe." Lillian's hands moved fast. She washed the grit from the wound, her fingers slippery with soap and blood. Kai's hands were right next to hers, anchoring the child. At one point, as Juniper kicked out, Kai's hand shifted and covered Lillian's to steady her. The contact was electric. His palm was rough, calloused from years of holding reins and rifles, but the heat of it seared through Lillian's skin. She froze for a fraction of a second. Looking up, Kai's eyes met hers. In the middle of the panic and the pain, there was a moment of profound, shared intimacy. They were two strangers fighting death together in a sunlit room. Lillian felt a flush rise from her neck to her cheeks, a heat that had nothing to do with the stove. She pulled her hand away and grabbed the needle. "I have to stitch it." The next 20 minutes were an eternity. Lillian worked with the precision of a seamstress, closing the jagged tear. Juniper sobbed, slipping in and out of consciousness, muttering words that were a mix of English and Apache. "Mama, the water is cold," she moaned. Then, switching to the guttural sounds of her father's language, she cried out for the spirits. "It is done," Lillian whispered finally. Tying off the last knot, she bandaged the leg with strips of clean white cotton. "It is done." She stepped back, wiping her hands on her apron. She was trembling. Kai released his daughter and slumped slightly, the adrenaline leaving him. He brushed the damp hair from Juniper's forehead. "You have good hands," he said, his voice rough. "Better than the butchers the army calls doctors." Lillian turned away to hide her shaking hands. "She needs rest. She cannot ride today. You will have to wait until the fever passes." She gestured to the small cot in the corner of the room, behind a privacy screen where she usually took her afternoon naps. Kai lifted Juniper and carried her there, laying her down on the quilt. The shop went quiet. The noise of the town outside seemed miles away. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall and Juniper's shallow breathing. Lillian poured a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove and held it out to Kai. He took it, his fingers brushing hers again. He did not sit. He stood by the door, his back to the frame, watching the street through the lace curtain, watching his daughter, watching Lillian. He was a sentinel. Lillian sat on the edge of the cot, watching the child. Juniper's color was returning, her breathing deepening into sleep. Lillian reached out and smoothed the blanket. She had not been this close to a child since she lost the baby she had carried for 3 months. Years ago, a secret sorrow she kept buried in the garden of her heart. Suddenly, Juniper's eyes opened. They were hazel and clear, lucid in a way that was unsettling. She did not look at her father. She looked straight at Lillian. The girl's gaze was heavy, older than her 7 years. She looked at Lillian's plain gray dress, then at the empty chair beside the fire, and finally, back at Lillian's face. "You need a husband," Juniper whispered. Her voice was scratchy but distinct in the quiet room. Lillian blinked, startled. She opened her mouth to hush the child, thinking it was the fever talking. But Juniper continued, her eyes drifting to Kai, who had stiffened by the door, and then back to Lillian. A single tear leaked from the corner of the girl's eye. "And I just want a mom." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The room went completely still. Lillian felt as if the air had been sucked out of her lungs. Her face burned with a sudden, intense mortification. It was as if the child had walked into the room and stripped them both naked, exposing the lonely, jagged holes in their lives that they tried so hard to hide. She looked at Kai. The warrior looked as if he had been struck. His mask of stoic indifference cracked. He looked at Lillian, and, for the first time, there was no guard up. She saw a man who was tired of being strong, a man who was just as lonely in his vast valley as she was in her crowded town. Lillian stammered, her hands fluttering uselessly over the blanket. "Hush now, child. You need to get well. That is all." But the words were out. They were alive in the room. "You need a husband? I want a mom." Kai cleared his throat. A low rumble. He looked down at his boots, shifting his weight. "She speaks, freely. Her mother taught her to speak her mind. I apologize if she offended you." "No," Lillian said quickly, too quickly. "No offense. She is confused." "She is not confused," Kai said softly. He looked at Lillian, his dark eyes burning. "She sees things, sometimes too clearly." The tension in the room shifted. It was no longer the tension of emergency. It was the tension of possibility. It was awkward, heavy, and terrifying. Bang, bang, bang. The fist pounding on the front door shattered the moment like glass. "Open up, Mrs. Hart!" It was Ezra Crowell. "I know he is in there." Lillian jumped up, her face hardening again. The spell was broken. Reality was banging on the wood. Kai moved instantly. His hand went to the knife at his belt, his body shifting between the door and the cot where Juniper lay. He was a wolf protecting the den. Lillian held up a hand to stop him. "Stay here," she hissed. "Do not draw a weapon. You give them a reason, and they will burn this place down." She smoothed her apron, took a deep breath, and unlocked the door, opening it only a crack. Crowell stood there, flanked by the sheriff and 2 of his hired hands. "What do you want?" "Mr. Crowell," Lillian asked coldly. "We want the Indian," Crowell said, peering over her shoulder. "The sheriff needs to question him about the wagon, and about the disruption of the peace." "He is tending to his daughter," Lillian said, blocking the view. A daughter who was maimed by a trap that had no business being so close to the road? Unless the sheriff wants to write a report about negligence and illegal trapping on public land, I suggest you leave them be. Crowell's eyes narrowed. He leaned in close, his voice dropping so the men behind him couldn't hear. "Careful. Lillian, you are a woman alone. Your lease on this building is up for renewal next month. My bank might decide that a woman who harbors savages is a poor investment." Lillian felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach. Her shop, her home, her sanctuary, he could take it all with the stroke of a pen. From the shadows of the shop, Kai heard every word. He understood the language of threat perfectly. It was the same tone the army officers used when they talked about treaties. He saw the way Lillian's hand gripped the doorframe, white-knuckled. He saw that she was trembling, not with fear, but with the effort of holding her ground. She was fighting for him. No one had fought for him in a very long time. "Get off my porch, Ezra," Lillian said, her voice shaking but clear. "Or I will tell the sheriff exactly where I saw your men setting those traps last Tuesday." It was a bluff. Lillian had seen nothing, but Crowell didn't know that. He sneered. Stepping back, "Have it your way, widow. But when the roof caves in on you, do not come crying to me." Crowell signaled to his men, and they turned away. Grumbling, Lillian watched them go until they turned the corner. Then she closed the door and leaned her forehead against the wood, exhaling a long, shaky breath. "You should not have done that," Kai said quietly from behind her. Lillian turned. Kai was standing closer than she realized. "They would have arrested you," she said. "They own the law here." Kai replied, "You made an enemy today, a powerful one." "I have been making enemies of men like him my whole life," Lillian said, pushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "I just usually do it silently." Kai looked around the shop. He looked at the water stain on the ceiling where the rain had come through last week. He looked at the rotting wood of the window frame. He looked at Lillian, small and defiant in her gray dress. "I cannot pay you money," Kai said. "I have a little silver." "I did not ask for money," Lillian said stiffly. "A warrior pays his debts," Kai stated. He gestured to the ceiling. "Your roof is bad. The wood is rotting. The fence in the back is broken." Lillian hugged her arms around herself. I cannot have you working here. The town, the talk." "Let them talk," Kai said. "You saved my daughter's leg. I will fix your house. I will stay until the girl can ride. 2 days, maybe 3. Lillian looked at Juniper, who was sleeping again. She looked at Kai. She thought about Crowell's threat. She thought about the winter coming and the leaks in the roof she couldn't afford to fix. And she thought about the silence that usually filled these rooms, a silence that Juniper had just broken with her wish for a mother. 2 days, Lillian whispered. "You sleep in the shed out back, not in the house." Kai nodded slowly. "The shed is fine." He moved past her to check on Juniper one last time. Lillian watched him. He moved with a quiet power that filled the space. For the first time in 2 years, the house didn't feel empty. It felt dangerous. It felt complicated, but it didn't feel empty. Outside, across the street, Ezra Crowell watched from the window of the marshal's office. He saw Kai step out the back door of the shop and begin to inspect the fence. Crowell lit a cigar, his eyes narrowing. "So," he muttered to himself, "the widow has a pet. Good. A man will do stupid things to protect a woman, and a woman will sign any paper to save a man." He blew a cloud of smoke against the glass. The game had just become much more interesting. The rhythmic thud, thud, thud of a hammer striking wood became the new heartbeat of the Hart establishment. For 3 days, the sound had echoed through the morning stillness, replacing the oppressive silence that usually suffocated Lillian Hart. Kai Redhawk was on the roof. From her position at the cutting table, Lillian could see him through the upper window of the loft. He had removed his heavy scout jacket and the faded army shirt, working only in his buckskin trousers and a thin, white cotton undershirt that was stained with the red dust of the high desert. The sun was merciless, yet he moved with a fluid, tireless economy of motion. Lillian found her eyes drifting upward more often than she cared to admit. She watched the muscles in his back shift and coil as he levered a fresh shingle into place. There was a raw, physical capability to him that was entirely different from the men in town. The men of Dust Creek were either soft from counting money or broken from digging for it. Kai was different. He was made of the same ironwood and granite as the land itself. She forced her gaze back to the needle in her hand, feeling a flush of heat rise up her neck that had nothing to do with the stove. "You are a widow," she chided herself sternly. "You are a respectable woman. Stop looking at him as if he were water in a drought." "Miss Lily," the small voice broke her trance. Juniper was sitting on the floor. surrounded by scraps of fabric she was tying into knots. Her leg was propped up on a pillow, the bandage clean and white against her honey-colored skin. "Yes, Juniper?" Lillian asked, her voice softening instinctively. "Is this an A?" The girl held up a slate where she had scrawled a lopsided triangle. Lillian moved to her side, kneeling down, ignoring the ache in her own knees, and guided the child's small hand. "Almost. It needs a belt across the middle. Like this." "A is for apple, and arrow." "And army?" Juniper asked, her face clouding. Lillian paused. "Yes, and the army." "I do not like that letter," Juniper decided, wiping the slate clean with her sleeve. Lillian smiled, a genuine small thing that felt foreign on her face. "Then we shall skip to B. B is for bear, and bread." Above them, the hammering stopped. A shadow fell over the back door, and Kai stepped in. He carried the scent of pine resin and sweat. He did not look at Lillian directly, but his presence filled the room, making the air feel suddenly thinner. "The roof is tight," he said, his voice low. "The rain will stay outside now." "Thank you," Lillian said, standing up and smoothing her apron. She felt the need to put a barrier between them, so she moved behind the counter. "There is coffee on the stove, and bread." "I do not need food," Kai said, though his eyes lingered on the fresh loaf. "I need to check the fence. Then we go." "She cannot ride yet," Lillian said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "The wound is knitting, but the saddle will tear it open." Kai looked at his daughter. Juniper looked back with wide, pleading eyes. She did not want to leave the house that smelled of lavender. She did not want to go back to the wind and the cold nights. "One more day," Kai conceded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I will fix the fence." The town, however, was not as accepting of this domestic arrangement as the occupants of the house. Lillian felt the change when she walked to the post office that afternoon. The conversations on the boardwalk didn't just stop. They were cut off with sharp, deliberate suddenness. Mrs. Gable, the wife of the town's banker, crossed the muddy street specifically to avoid passing Lillian on the sidewalk. It was Sheriff Miller who finally put words to the cold shoulders. He stopped Lillian outside the general store, tipping his hat with a politeness that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Hart," he said, hooking his thumbs into his gun belt. "I have been hearing complaints about my sewing." "Sheriff," Lillian asked, clutching her parcel of thread. "About your house guest," Miller said. "Folks are uneasy. Having a Red Hawk warrior sleeping in your shed, walking around your yard, it sends a message. Some say you are forgetting who your people are." Lillian straightened her spine. "My people, Sheriff, are the ones who pay their bills and mind their own business. Mr. Red Hawk is working off a debt. He is repairing the property that no one else in this town offered to help a widow fix for 2 years. Miller sighed, scratching his jaw. "I am just giving you friendly advice." "Lillian, Ezra Crowell is stirring the pot. He is saying it is not safe for the children to come to your school while that man is there. If the parents pull the children, you lose your tuition money. Can you afford that?" Lillian went cold. It was a direct threat to her livelihood. "I will not turn a wounded child and her father out into the street. Sheriff," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Just be careful," Miller warned, stepping aside. "A storm is coming, and you are standing under the only lightning rod in town." Lillian walked back to her shop, her heart pounding. She realized with terrifying clarity that the safety she had carefully built, the invisibility she had cultivated, was gone. She had stepped into the light, and the light was harsh. She looked at her shop, at the new shingles on the roof, and wondered if doing the right thing was worth losing everything. While Lillian fought her battles on the street, Ezra Crowell was fighting a war on a map, in the back room of the Golden Nugget. Crowell unrolled a large parchment across a poker table. Sitting opposite him was a man in a dusty travel suit, a surveyor for the Union Pacific named Mr. Sterling. "Here," Crowell said, stabbing a finger onto the paper. "This is the bottleneck." He pointed to a narrow pass where the mountains squeezed the land tight before opening up into a lush, green expanse. White Elk Valley. Sterling read the label. The survey says the gradient is perfect for the trek, but the reports say it is occupied. Squatters. Crowell spat, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey. A splinter group of the Apache. They claim it is ancestral land, sacred ground. They refuse to move to the reservation north of the river. The railroad does not like Indian trouble. Crowell, Sterling said, eyeing the whiskey. It scares the investors in Boston. There will be no trouble, Crowell assured him, his smile oily and confident. I have bought every acre surrounding that valley. I control the access to the east and the south. I will squeeze them until they have to leave. I will turn that valley into the biggest holding pen for cattle in the territory, with the train running right through the middle. And the scout? Sterling asked. The one they talk about, Kai Redhawk. Crowell's face darkened. He is the gatekeeper. He knows the trails better than the coyotes. As long as he is leading them, they think they can survive. But remove the shepherd, and the sheep will scatter. He took a slow sip of whiskey. And now, he has given me a weapon. He has tied himself to the widow Hart. He has a weakness for her, or for the soft life she offers. I can use that. You would hurt a white woman? Sterling asked, raising an eyebrow. I will not have to hurt her, Crowell said softly. I will just make it impossible for her to survive unless she does exactly what I say. She is just a piece on the board. Mr. Sterling, a pawn to capture a knight. Evening brought a chill wind down from the mountains, but the air inside the kitchen was warm. Lillian had prepared a stew, meager but hot. Kai had finished the fence. He stood by the back door, washing his hands in a basin Lillian had set out on a crate. He had scrubbed the dirt from his skin, but the stains of his life remained. Lillian stepped out onto the porch with a kettle of hot water. Here, she said. The pump water is freezing tonight. She poured the steaming water into the basin. Kai paused, his hands suspended in the water. In the lantern light, Lillian saw the scars. They were not just marks. They were a history of violence. There was a jagged white line running from his wrist to his elbow, and a circular puckered mark on his shoulder, a bullet wound. Without thinking, Lillian reached out. Her fingertips, pale and smooth, brushed against the rough, copper skin of his forearm, tracing the long scar. The war, she whispered. Kai did not pull away. He went very still, watching her hand on his arm. A saber, he said, his voice devoid of emotion, yet heavy with memory. 5 years ago, we were trying to hold the river crossing. Does it hurt? Lillian asked, looking up into his face. Only when the weather changes, Kai said. He looked at her, and the distance between them seemed to vanish. And when I remember who held the sword, Lillian realized her hand was still on his arm. She could feel the heat of his blood beneath the skin, the strength of the muscle. It was a dangerous connection. She was a woman who had sworn off men, and he was a man who belonged to a vanishing world. She pulled her hand back as if it was burning. I will bring a towel. Lillian, he said her name, not Mrs. Hart, Lillian. It sounded different in his voice, deeper, more significant. She stopped at the door, her hand on the latch. She did not turn around. Yes, thank you, Kai said. For the water, ideally. Warmth is a luxury I had forgotten. Lillian fled into the kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Later that night, as the fire burned low, Juniper called them over. She was sitting on the rug with a piece of charcoal and a scrap of brown wrapping paper. Look, she said proudly. I made a picture. Lillian and Kai leaned in. The drawing was crude, as children's drawings are, but the intent was clear. There were 3 figures standing in front of the shop. A small girl with wild hair, a tall man with a feather in his hair, and a woman. The woman in the picture was wearing a dress, not the gray calico Lillian always wore. Juniper had used a piece of white chalk she had found to color the dress bright, stark white. This is us, Juniper explained, pointing a small finger. Papa, me, and Miss Lily. And Miss Lily is wearing her happy dress. Lillian stared at the drawing. A white dress? A wedding dress. The innocence of the child's wish cut through her defenses like a knife. She felt a sudden, Sharp ache in her chest, a longing so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She wanted to be that woman in the picture. She wanted to be happy. She wanted to be part of an us. She looked up and caught Kai's eye. He was looking at the drawing too, his expression unreadable, but his jaw was tight. He knew what the white dress meant. He knew what his daughter was asking for. "It is beautiful, Juniper," Lillian choked out. She reached out and touched the paper, her finger resting on the white figure. "But dreams are for sleeping, child." "Not always," Kai said quietly. "Sometimes dreams are maps." Lillian looked at him, startled by the intensity in his voice. For a moment, in the flickering firelight, she allowed herself to imagine it. A life where she wasn't alone. A life where this silent, strong warrior stood between her and the world. Then the wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, reminding her of the reality waiting in the dark. The storm broke 2 days later, but it wasn't rain that caused the damage. It was thundering. A dry storm rolled over the plains, the sky cracking open with violent peals of thunder that shook the ground. Ezra Crowell's cattle herd, grazing near the boundary of the White Elk Valley, panicked. The stampede was a terrifying force of nature. 500 head of cattle, blind with fear, turned and surged toward the canyon drop-off. Kai saw it from the roof of the shed. He didn't hesitate. "Stay inside," he shouted to Lillian. Grabbing his bridle, he vaulted onto his paint horse bareback, shouting a war cry that made the hair on Lillian's arms stand up. He rode not away from the danger, but toward it. He was joined by 3 other riders from his tribe who had been watching from the ridge. They intercepted the herd, riding dangerously close to the horns, waving blankets and firing pistols into the air to turn the leaders. It took an hour of desperate, dusty chaos. But they turned the herd. They saved Crowell's investment from plunging into the ravine. When the dust settled, Kai rode back toward the town line, his horse lathered. Ezra Crowell rode out to meet him, flanked by his hired guns. Lillian watched from her porch, expecting gratitude. "You!" Crowell shouted, pointing a gloved finger at Kai. "I told you to keep your savages off my land." Kai wiped dust from his face. "Your cattle were running to their deaths. We turned them." "You spooked them," Crowell accused, his face red. "It was your people lurking on the ridge that set them off. If I find 1 head of cattle missing, Red Hawk, I will hang you from the nearest cottonwood." Kai stared at him, his face a mask of disgust. "Next time, Crowell, I will let the canyon take them. And you." He turned his horse and rode back to Lillian's shop. He dismounted slowly, his shoulders heavy. "There is no peace with him," Kai said to Lillian as he walked past her. "He does not want neighbors. He wants subjects." The retaliation was swift and silent. The next morning, Lillian went to the pump in her kitchen to fill the kettle. It rattled and hissed, but no water came out. She worked the handle frantically. Nothing. She went outside to the rain barrel. It had been overturned in the night, the stave smashed. She ran to the town well. A wooden cover had been nailed over it, with a sign, "Closed for repairs. Order of the mayor." Crowell was the mayor. Lillian stormed to the general store to buy bottled water. The clerk, a man she had known for 5 years, refused to look her in the eye. "Sorry, Mrs. Hart," he mumbled. "Stock is low. Mr. Crowell bought it all for the mine workers. He is trying to thirst us out," Lillian realized, her voice trembling with rage. "He is holding the water hostage." She returned to the shop, defeated. Juniper was thirsty, her lips dry. Lillian had nothing to give her but a cup of dregs from the bottom of a pitcher. Crowell appeared an hour later. He stood at the gate, looking cool and refreshed. "Terrible business about the well," he called out. "Dry season is hard on a woman alone. You know, Lillian, my offer still stands. I have a buyer for this lot. Good money. Enough to take a train to San Francisco. You could be drinking iced tea in a hotel lobby by Friday." Lillian gripped the porch railing until her knuckles turned white. "I will not sell." "Then you will thirst," Crowell said, his smile vanishing. "And so will the girl, and so will the savage." He walked away. Lillian went inside, sinking into a chair. She was trapped. She could not let Juniper suffer. She was about to weep when Kai placed a hand on her shoulder. "Pack a bag," he said. "What?" Lillian looked up. "He controls the wells in town," Kai said. "He does not control the earth. I know a place. The water there never runs dry. It is sweet and cold. But the shop. The shop is wood and stone." Kai said intensely, "You are flesh and blood. The girl needs water. Come." Lillian looked at the dry pitcher. She looked at Juniper. She realized that staying meant surrendering to Crowell. Leaving meant trusting Kai completely. She stood up. "Saddle the horse." They rode out an hour later, avoiding the main road. Kai led them through dry arroyos and over rocky ridges where no wagon could follow. Lillian rode behind Kai, her arms wrapped around his waist, Juniper sitting in front of him. For the first time, Lillian left the safety of the town behind. As they climbed higher, the dust of the town fell away. The air became cleaner, thinner, smelling of sage and pine. Kai led them through a narrow fissure in the rocks, a hidden gate that looked like nothing more than a shadow from a distance. When they emerged on the other side, Lillian gasped. The White Elk Valley spread out before them like a green jewel set in red gold. A river wound through the center, sparkling in the sun. Tall grass waved in the wind. A herd of wild horses grazed in the distance. It was a place of breathtaking, primal beauty. "This is my home," Kai said simply. He guided the horse down to the riverbank. The water was clear and fast running. Lillian slid off the horse and knelt by the water, cupping it in her hands. She drank. It was the sweetest, coldest water she had ever tasted. She splashed it on her face, washing away the dust of Dust Creek, washing away the fear. She looked up to see Kai watching her. He looked different here, taller, at peace. He belonged to this land, and for a moment, Lillian felt a fierce envy. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "It is life," Kai said. He sat down on a rock, letting Juniper splash in the shallows. Lillian sat beside him. For a long time, they didn't speak. They just watched the water and the child. The silence here wasn't heavy or lonely. It was companionable. It was the silence of two souls resting. Lillian looked at Kai's profile. She saw the sadness there, but also the strength. She realized that she had fallen in love with the town because it was a cage she understood. But this freedom, it terrified and exhilarated her. "I never knew this was here," she said softly. "Few eyes see it," Kai said. "We keep it hidden to keep it safe." But they were not as hidden as they thought. High above them, on the limestone ridge overlooking the hidden entrance, a glint of sunlight flashed off metal. It was a telescope. A man lay on his stomach, chewing a piece of straw. He was one of Crowell's hired trackers. He had followed the tracks of the paint horse. He watched Lillian and Kai by the water. He watched the secret path they had taken through the rocks. He lowered the telescope and grinned, his teeth yellow. "Gotcha," he whispered. He scrambled back from the edge, mounted his horse, and turned back toward Dust Creek. He had the key to the valley. Kai's act of kindness bringing the woman to the water had just given Ezra Crowell the map to the invasion. Below, in the valley, a hawk circled overhead, crying out a warning that neither Lillian nor Kai understood. The sanctuary was breached. The storm was no longer coming. It was already here. The smoke from the council fire curled upward, vanishing into the black throat of the night sky above White Elk Valley. It was a dark night, the moon hidden behind a thick bank of clouds that promised heavy rain. Kai Redhawk sat cross-legged on the earth, the warmth of the fire doing little to thaw the cold knot in his stomach. Around the circle sat the elders of his tribe, their faces etched with the deep lines of worry. White Crane, the oldest among them, held a pipe with trembling hands. "They have found the path," Kai said, his voice low and steady. "I saw the glint of glass on the ridge. Crowell knows the way in." Black Moon, the warrior who had warned Kai days before, slammed his fist into the dirt. "Then we fight," we rode out tonight. "We burn the town. We cut the throat of the snake before it can swallow us." "And what of the women?" White Crane asked softly. What of the children? We have 30 rifles, Black Moon. They have the United States cavalry. If we strike the town, they will bring cannons. They will turn this valley into a graveyard. Kai looked into the fire. He felt the crushing weight of leadership. He had tried to walk the line between two worlds, to eat the bread of the white man so his people would not starve. But the line had been erased. By taking Lillian to the water, he had shown the enemy the door. The guilt tasted like bile. We cannot attack, Kai said. But we cannot stay here and wait to be slaughtered. Crowell wants the land, not the blood. If we leave, Black Moon spat. To where the reservation to eat rot and die of coughing sickness. This is our home. The bones of our fathers are in these rocks. I will not let us die, Kai vowed. But I need time. I need to know what the soldiers will do. The answer came 2 days later, not with a whisper, but with a roar. News reached Dust Creek before the sun was high. A supply train belonging to the Union Pacific had been derailed and looted 10 miles to the south. The conductor was dead. The guards were wounded, and, according to the survivors, the attackers had ridden painted horses and whooped war cries. Ezra Crowell stood on the steps of the courthouse, his face a mask of righteous indignation. It is an act of war, Crowell bellowed to the frightened crowd. We offer them charity, and they repay us with murder. They are savages, pure and simple. And I tell you this, they did not act alone. They have spies. They have sympathizers right here in Dust Creek. Lillian Hart heard the speech from her open door. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. She knew Kai. She knew he had been in the valley, arguing for peace. This was a lie. It was a play. Half an hour later, Sheriff Miller walked into her shop. He looked tired, his badge heavy on his shirt. Mrs. Hart, he said, taking off his hat. I have unpleasant business. Then speak it plain. Sheriff, Lillian said, her hands gripping the counter. I have a warrant, Miller said, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. For Kai Redhawk, for the robbery of the Union Pacific train and the murder of Conductor Evans. That is absurd, Lillian snapped. He was not there. I know where he was. Can you prove it? Miller asked pointedly. Were you with him, Lillian alone in the wilderness? Because if you admit that to a judge, you ruin yourself forever. Lillian fell silent. Miller sighed. Crowell has witnesses. Men who say they saw Redhawk leading the raid. The colonel is sending a detachment from the fort. They are coming to sweep the valley. If Redhawk resists, they will hang him. He leaned in closer. And Crowell has been talking about you. Lillian. He brought up your husband. Lillian froze. My husband is dead. Crowell says Deputy Marshal Hart used to do enforcement work for the rail companies back in Kansas, Miller said quietly. He says your husband burned out squatters and broke strikes. Crowell is saying you are just like him, playing both sides to get ahead. He says you are harboring a criminal to get a cut of the stolen loot. Lillian felt the blood drain from her face. It was a monstrous lie, twisted around a grain of truth. Her husband had been a brutal man, and she had lived on his money. She had eaten food bought with the suffering of others. Stay away from the Indian. Lillian, Miller warned, putting his hat back on. When the cavalry comes, do not be standing next to him. Lillian closed the shop early. She felt sick. She felt the ghost of her husband standing in the corner, smelling of whiskey and gunpowder, laughing at her attempts to be decent. She walked out the back door. Kai was there, chopping wood for the stove. He stopped when he saw her face. What is it? He asked. They are coming for you, Lillian said, her voice trembling. They say you robbed the train. Kai drove the axe into the stump with a single, violent motion. Crowell. Yes, I must go, Kai said, turning toward the shed to gather his things. I must get the women and children into the caves before the soldiers arrive. Wait, Lillian said. Kai, wait. She walked past the town limits, down toward the river where the willows grew thick and provided some privacy. Kai followed her, sensing her distress was not just for him. By the rushing water, Lillian turned to him. The sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the water. Crowell told them about my husband, she whispered. Kai stood silent, waiting. He was not just a gambler, Lillian confessed, the words tearing out of her throat. He was a hired gun for the land companies. He hurt people. He burned houses. I knew it. I knew it every time he came home with money in his pocket. And I said nothing. I sewed my dresses and I taught the children. And I pretended I did not know where the bread came from. She looked up at Kai, tears streaming down her face. I am a coward, Kai. I have always been a coward. I let bad men do bad things because I was afraid to be hungry. And now Crowell is using that against me. Kai stepped closer. The distance between them, usually so carefully maintained, vanished. He reached out and placed his hand over her heart. His palm was warm, solid, and real. You are not your husband, Kai said firmly. And you are not a coward. A coward would have left my daughter to bleed in the street. A coward would have sold this house to Crowell and left. I am afraid, Lillian wept. So am I, Kai admitted. His voice was rough with emotion. I am afraid every time I close my eyes, I see the faces of the men I have buried. I see Juniper growing up in a world that hates her. Fear does not make you a coward. Lillian, it makes you human. Lillian raised her hand and covered his, pressing it tighter against her chest. She could feel the calluses on his skin, the history of his battles. She looked into his obsidian eyes and saw her own pain reflected there. We are both broken, she whispered. Perhaps, Kai said softly. Or perhaps we are just being forged into something new. He moved his hand from her chest to her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. The touch was electric. It sent a shockwave through Lillian that silenced her fear. For a moment, there was no town, no army, no past. There was only the heat of his skin and the sound of the river. That night, the sky broke open. A storm of biblical fury descended on Dust Creek. Rain hammered the roof of the shop like lead shot. The wind howled, rattling the shutters until they threatened to fly off the hinges. The road to the valley was washed out. The river was a raging torrent. Kai could not leave. They huddled in the main room of the shop, the safest place in the house. Lillian had moved the cutting table against the door to brace it. The fire in the stove roared, fighting back the damp chill that seeped through the floorboards. Juniper was asleep on the cot, exhausted by the tension she could feel but not understand. Lillian and Kai sat on the rug in front of the stove. The air was cold, despite the fire. You are shivering, Kai observed. He reached for the heavy wool blanket from the back of the sofa and draped it over Lillian's shoulders. He did not pull his hand away. Instead, he sat down next to her, close enough that their arms touched. Lillian hesitated, then lifted the corner of the blanket and extended it to him. It is big enough for two. Kai accepted the invitation. He shifted closer, pulling the wool around his own shoulders. Under the tent of the blanket, their body heat pooled, creating a small, private world. Lillian rested her head on his shoulder. It felt inevitable. It felt like coming home. She could smell the rain on his hair, the wood smoke on his clothes, and the scent of him clean and masculine. Kai's arm went around her, his hand resting tentatively on her upper arm. His grip was firm, protective. They watched the firelight dance on the walls. The intimacy was overwhelming. Lillian could feel the steady beat of his heart against her side. She turned her face slightly, looking up at him. Kai was looking down at her. His eyes were dark pools of desire, raw and unguarded. He wanted her. She could feel it in the tension of his body, in the way his breath hitched slightly. And she wanted him. She wanted to forget the propriety, the widow's weeds, the shame. She wanted to feel alive. But neither of them moved. To cross that line now, with the army coming, with his life hanging by a thread, felt like a theft. It felt like taking something they had not yet earned the right to keep. Kai leaned his forehead against hers. He closed his eyes, breathing in her scent. When this is over, he whispered, his voice a vibration against her skin. When this is over, Lillian echoed, a promise in the dark. They sat like that for hours, holding each other against the storm, two shipwrecked souls finding land in the dark. The morning brought clear skies. But no relief. The sound of bugles cut through the dawn. A column of cavalry, 50 men strong, rode into Dust Creek. They were not the tired patrol from before. These were fresh troops, grim-faced and heavily armed. Captain Halloway, a man with a handlebar mustache and eyes like flint, set up his command post in the hotel. Ezra Crowell was at his side immediately, pointing, talking, gesturing toward the shop. Within the hour, a sergeant pounded on Lillian's door. "Kai Redhawk," the sergeant bellowed. "By order of the United States Army, you are under arrest for treason and murder. Come out with your hands raised." Inside the shop, the air turned to ice. Juniper, who had been playing with a doll in the corner, scrambled up, her eyes wide with terror. She ran to Lillian, burying her face in Lillian's skirts. "No," the child cried. "Do not let them take him. They will hang him. I heard the men say it." Kai stood by the window, peering through the crack in the shutter. He turned to look at them. He looked calm, but it was the calm of a man who had accepted his death. "I will go out," Kai said. "If I surrender, they will not burn the shop. They will not hurt you." "No," Lillian grabbed his arm. "If you walk out there, Crowell wins. He will have you hanged before the trial even starts." Juniper looked up at Lillian, her face streaked with tears. "Miss Lily, if Papa is taken, if he goes away, will you keep me or will they take me too?" The question struck Lillian like a physical blow. She looked at the terrified child. She looked at the man she had sat with through the storm. She realized that she was no longer just a bystander. She was the only thing standing between this child and the abyss. "Nobody is taking anyone," Lillian said, her voice fierce. "We have to run," Kai said, checking the load in his revolver. "I can get us out the back, through the alley. We can steal horses. We go north, to Canada." "No," Lillian said. She stood in the center of the room, her hands clenched into fists. "We do not run. If we run, Crowell takes the valley. He takes the town. He wins." "Lillian, be reasonable," Kai argued. "There are 50 soldiers out there. I cannot fight an army." "We do not fight them with guns," Lillian said, her mind racing. "We fight them with the truth." "The truth," Kai laughed bitterly. "Crowell owns the truth." "Not all of it," Lillian said. She grabbed Kai's shoulders, forcing him to look at her. "My husband, he was a meticulous man. He kept records. He had insurance." "What are you saying?" "Before he died, he told me about a job he did for Crowell and the railroad," Lillian said, the memory surfacing through the panic. "A land survey, a real one. One that proves the valley is not suitable for the main line because of the floodplain. One that proves Crowell falsified the reports to the government to get the funding." Kai stared at her. "Where is this paper?" "He said he left it with his lawyer," Lillian said. "Mr. Abernathy." "Abernathy is dead," Kai said. "He died last winter." "Yes," Lillian nodded. "And Crowell bought his practice. He bought the building. The papers are in the safe in Crowell's office. Crowell probably does not even know what is in the old archive files. He is too arrogant to look at." "It is a trap," Kai said. "Crowell's office is in the center of town." "The soldiers are watching the front of the shop," Lillian said. "They are waiting for you. They are not watching the lawyer's office." She took a deep breath. "Here is the plan. You go out the back. You lead the soldiers away. You take them on a chase toward the valley. Make them think you are retreating to the fort. And you, I am going to rob a bank," Lillian said, a grim smile touching her lips. "Or a law office, at least." "It is too dangerous," Kai protested. "Juniper," Lillian said, looking at the girl. "Take your father's knife. Go into the cellar. Do not come out until I call you. Do you understand?" Juniper nodded, her eyes huge, but she took the knife Kai handed her and scrambled down the trap door. Lillian turned back to Kai. "If we run, we are fugitives forever. If we get that contract, we end this. We bring Crowell down." Kai looked at her with a mixture of awe and fear. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had made her drag a bleeding child into her shop. "You are a warrior," Kai whispered. "I am a mother," Lillian corrected him, looking at the closed trap door. "Now go. Give me 20 minutes." Then lead them to hell. Kai grabbed her. He kissed her hard on the forehead. A desperate benediction. Stay alive, Lillian Hart. He turned and slipped out the back window. Moments later, a shout went up from the street. There he goes, toward the river. The sound of boots and hooves thundered past the shop. The siege was broken. The hunt was on. Lillian waited until the noise faded. She smoothed her gray dress. She reached into her sewing basket and pulled out a small, sharp pair of scissors and a pry bar she used for opening crates. She slipped them into her pocket. She opened the front door and stepped out into the blinding sun. The street was empty. Everyone was chasing the Indian. Lillian Hart began to walk toward Ezra Crowell's office. She did not walk like a widow. She walked like a woman who was coming to collect a debt. The wind howling through the narrow neck of the White Elk Valley did not sound like wind anymore. It sounded like a warning. Kai Redhawk crouched behind a boulder of red sandstone, his body pressed low against the earth. Below him, the secret trail, the one he had foolishly shown to Lillian, snaked its way up from the flatlands. Beside him lay Black Moon, checking the priming on his rifle, and two young men from Dust Creek. They were boys. Really, sons of miners Kai had pulled from a collapsed shaft 3 winters ago. They held their hunting muskets with white-knuckled grips, their faces smeared with mud to hide their pale skin. Steady, Kai whispered. Do not fire until the lead horse passes the split rock. My hands are shaking, Mr. Hawk. One of the boys, a lad named Thomas, confessed in a whisper. Good, Kai said, not looking away from the trail. Shaking hands means you are alive. Keep them alive. Behind them, deep in the throat of the valley, the tribe was moving. It was a silent exodus. The old women carried the babies. The old men supported the injured. They were vanishing into the limestone caves high up the canyon walls, places where the cavalry horses could not climb. They were leaving their teepees, their fires, and their lives behind, hoping that stone would protect them where treaties had failed. Kai felt a heavy stone in his chest. He was not just fighting for land today. He was fighting for the right to exist. And somewhere, miles away in the hostile heart of the town, Lillian was fighting a different kind of battle. Dust Creek was eerily quiet. The men were gone, either riding with the posse or hiding in the saloon. The street was empty, save for the tumbleweeds skittering across the boardwalks. Lillian Hart stood at the back door of the law office. It was a sturdy brick building, the symbol of order in a lawless land. Now, it was Ezra Crowell's fortress. Are you sure about this? Miss Lily, whispered the small boy beside her. It was Samuel, one of her brightest students, a street urchin who could climb any roof in town. I am sure, Samuel, Lillian said, her voice tighter than she liked. She looked down at Juniper, who was huddled in a heavy cloak that was too big for her. Juniper, you stay with the horses behind the livery. If you hear shooting, you ride. Do not wait for me. I am not leaving you, Juniper said, her jaw set with a stubbornness that was entirely her father's. This is not a negotiation, Lillian said sharply, then softened. She cupped the girl's cheek. I need to know you are safe so I can be brave. Go. Juniper hesitated, then turned and ran toward the horses. Lillian took a deep breath. She pulled a heavy iron key from her pocket. It had been given to her that morning by the old clerk, who used to work for her husband's lawyer, a man who had been cheated out of his pension by Crowell. Lillian slid the key into the lock. It turned with a stiff, reluctant click. She pushed the door open and slipped into the shadows of the office. It smelled of stale cigar smoke and expensive leather. It smelled like Ezra Crowell. Forward! Crowell shouted, waving his hat in the air. The valley is open. Everything from here to the horizon will bear the name Crowell by sunset. He rode at the head of the column, flanked by 20 mercenaries, hard men with cold eyes who killed for $5 a day. Behind them rode Captain Halloway and 30 cavalrymen. The soldiers looked less enthusiastic. They were trained to fight wars, not to evict families for a cattle baron. The column entered the narrow pass. The walls of the canyon rose up like the sides of a tomb, red and imposing. Mr. Crowell, Captain Halloway said, trotting his horse up beside the tycoon. This terrain is a bottleneck. If they have shooters on the ridge... They are starving savages, Captain... Crowell scoffed. They have bows and rusted muskets. One volley from your carbines will send them running like rabbits. As if the canyon itself took offense to his words. The ground beneath the lead mercenary's horse gave way, with a sickening crunch of wood breaking. The trail collapsed into a hidden pit. The horse screamed, plunging downward, throwing its rider against the rock wall. Now! Kai's voice echoed from the cliffs. Arrows rained down, not to kill, but to maim. They struck the ground in front of the horses, sending the animals into a panic. Boulders, pushed by unseen hands, crashed down from the heights, blocking the path forward. Ambush! Holloway roared. Dismount! Take cover! The soldiers scrambled off their horses, pressing themselves against the canyon walls. But Crowell's mercenaries were in disarray. They fired wildly at the rocks, wasting ammunition on shadows. Kai moved like a phantom along the ridge. He fired his Winchester, the shot echoing like a cannon crack. A mercenary's hat flew off. Kai levered the action, moved 10 feet, and fired again, hitting the dirt near Crowell's boots. He is mocking us, Crowell screamed, his face purple with rage. He looked up, scanning the brush, but he saw nothing but rocks and sage. Burn them out, Sergeant, burn the brush. Sir, the wind is picking up, a sergeant yelled back. If we light a fire in this box canyon... I gave you an order, Crowell shrieked, pulling his own pistol and firing blindly at the cliffs. Flush the rats out, burn it all! One of the mercenaries grabbed a torch, lit it, and threw it into a patch of dry scrub oak. The effect was instantaneous. The dry wood, seasoned by a summer of drought, caught with a whoosh sound. The wind, channeling through the canyon like air through a bellows, grabbed the flame and threw it upward. In the office, Lillian's hands flew through the files in the safe. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Deeds, mining claims, bank drafts. Where is it? She hissed. Where is the survey? She heard footsteps on the boardwalk outside, heavy boots. She dug deeper, to the back of the safe, where the dust lay thick. Her fingers closed around a leather folio tied with a black ribbon. The label on the spine read, White Elk Survey, 1874. Private. Got you, she whispered. She tucked the folio into her bodice and turned to the door. Standing in the doorway was one of Crowell's hired guards. He was a big man with a broken nose, holding a shotgun loosely in one hand. Well now, the man grinned, stepping inside and kicking the door shut. The Widow Hart. Mister, Crowell said you might come sniffing around. Lillian froze. She was trapped. The desk was between them, but he had the gun. Step away from the desk, darling, the man said, leering. And give me whatever you stole. Lillian's hand went to her pocket. She felt the cold steel of the scissors, but she knew she could never get close enough to use them. Her fingers brushed against a box of matches she had taken from the mantel. Her eyes darted to the kerosene lamp on the desk. It was full. I said, give it here. The man stepped forward. Lillian grabbed the lamp. Stay back. The man laughed. Or what you will sew me to death. Lillian struck a match. The flame flared, bright and blue. She held it to the wick of the lamp, but instead of replacing the glass chimney, she held the lamp high. This building is made of old wood and paper, Lillian said, her voice trembling but loud. And this lamp is full of oil. If you take one more step, I will drop it. We will both burn, and Mr. Crowell's empire will burn with us. The guard hesitated. He saw the look in her eyes. It was the look of a cornered animal. You are crazy, he muttered. I am a widow. Lillian corrected him. I have nothing left to lose. Try me. She fainted, pretending to throw the lamp. The guard flinched, ducking his head and raising his arms. Lillian hurled the lamp not at him, but at the shelf of law books behind him. The glass shattered. The oil sprayed and ignited instantly. A wall of fire erupted between them. The guard shouted, stumbling back from the heat. Lillian seized the moment. She vaulted over the low railing, ducked under the smoke, and sprinted for the door. She burst out into the alley, gasping for air. The smoke was already billowing from the window. "Juniper!" she screamed, running toward the livery. The fire in the valley was no longer a tactic. It was a monster. The wind had shifted. Instead of burning up the ridge toward the warriors, the flames had turned, pushed by a downdraft. They were racing along the valley floor, straight toward the hidden caves where the women and children were hiding. Kai stood on the precipice, watching the horror unfold. The wall of orange flame was moving faster than a horse could run. "They are trapped!" Black Moon shouted, pointing to the smoke rising from the canyon floor. The fire cut off the path to the caves. Kai looked down at Crowell and the soldiers. They were retreating, pushed back by the heat of their own making. He had a clear shot at Crowell. He could end it right now. He could put a bullet in the man's heart. But if he took the shot, he lost the seconds he needed to get down the cliff. Kai lowered his rifle. "Forget the soldiers," Kai ordered his men. "Get the blankets. We have to break the fire line." He turned his back on his enemy and dove down the scree slope, sliding and jumping, racing the fire to save his blood. Lillian galloped out of Dust Creek, the folio pressing against her ribs. The horse was flying, sensing her urgency. But as she crested the rise leading to the valley, her heart stopped. The sky ahead was black with smoke. The horizon was glowing and angry, violent orange. "Juniper!" Lillian yelled over the wind. She looked behind her. Juniper was supposed to be on the pony following her, but the trail behind was empty. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. The gunfire earlier, the explosion of the window in the office. The horses had spooked. Lillian spun her horse around, searching the scrubland. Then she saw it. A small pony, riderless, was grazing near a mesquite bush a mile back, and running on foot toward the smoke toward her father was a small figure in a large cloak. Juniper had seen the smoke. She was running into the fire to find Kai. "No!" Lillian screamed. She kicked her horse into a frenzy, galloping not away from the inferno, but straight into the edge of it. The heat was physical, a wall of pressure that sucked the moisture from Kai's eyes. He was on the valley floor now, swinging a wet, heavy blanket, beating at the flames that licked at the base of the cliffs. "Back, get back!" he shouted to the women huddled on the ledge above. The smoke was blinding. He could not breathe. He could not see. "Papa!" The voice was faint, swallowed by the roar of the fire. Kai froze. He spun around. Through the shifting curtain of gray smoke, he saw a small figure standing frozen in a patch of unburned grass, surrounded by a ring of fire that was closing in fast. "Juniper!" He lunged forward, but the heat drove him back. A pine tree exploded into flames between them, blocking his path. "Kai!" From the other side of the firewall, a horse burst through the smoke. Lillian was clinging to the mane, her face wrapped in her shawl. She saw the child. She saw Kai on the other side of the burning tree. Lillian did not stop. She drove the horse through the gap in the flames, the animal screaming in terror but obeying her will. She reached the center of the ring where Juniper stood. She practically fell from the saddle, grabbing the child and shielding her with her own body. "Lillian!" Kai roared. He took a running start and leaped over the burning trunk of the fallen pine. He landed heavily, rolling and coming up beside them. They were together, in the center of hell. "The blanket!" Kai shouted. He grabbed the wool blanket Lillian had brought. "Under it, both of you." He threw the blanket over Lillian and Juniper, huddling them close to the ground. He threw his own body over them, shielding them with his buckskin-clad back. The fire roared over them. It sounded like a freight train. The heat was unbearable. Lillian could smell singing hair and burning leather. She held Juniper so tight she thought she might crush her. She felt Kai's weight pressing down, his heavy breathing, his heart hammering against her back. For 1 minute, they were a single organism, united by terror and love. Then, the wind shifted again. The roar lessened. Kai threw the blanket off. "Now run to the river, go." He hauled them up. Lillian grabbed Juniper's hand. Kai grabbed Lillian's arm. Together, they ran through the blackened, smoking wasteland, stumbling over roots and rocks until they splashed into the cool, saving water of the river. They collapsed in the shallows, gasping, coughing up soot. They were alive. "Well, that is touching," the voice came from the bank. Ezra Crowell sat on his horse, his face smeared with soot, his fine suit ruined, but in his hand, he held a long-barreled Colt revolver. He leveled it straight at Kai's chest. Behind him, Captain Halloway and the soldiers were emerging from the smoke, looking battered and furious. "You have caused me a great deal of trouble, Red Hawk," Crowell rasped. "And you, Mrs. Hart, arsonist, thief, put the gun down." "Crowell," Kai said, standing up slowly, water dripping from his hair. He moved to step in front of Lillian and Juniper. "No." Crowell smiled, and it was a skull's smile. "I think I will finish this. I will say you resisted. Who will contradict me, the savage, the dead widow?" He cocked the hammer. The click was loud in the sudden silence. Kai tensed, ready to spring, ready to die to buy them a second. Lillian stepped out from behind Kai. She did not look like a victim. Her gray dress was scorched, her hair hung in wet strings, and her face was black with soot, but her eyes were blazing with a fire hotter than the one in the valley. She walked straight toward the gun. "Shoot me then, Ezra," she said. "Lillian," Kai yelled, reaching for her. "Stay back, Kai," she commanded. She reached into her bodice and pulled out the leather folio. It was damp, but intact. She held it up high for the soldiers to see. "Captain Halloway," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Do you know what this is?" Crowell's eyes flicked to the folio. His confidence faltered. That is nothing. Stolen property." "This," Lillian shouted, walking past the gun barrel as if it were a twig, straight toward the captain, "is the original geological survey for the White Elk Valley, signed by the chief engineer of the Union Pacific in 1874. She thrust the papers at the captain, who took them instinctively. "Read the addendum." "Captain," Lillian panted. "Read what, mister?" "Crowell paid my husband to hide." Crowell swung the gun toward Lillian. "Give that back." "Lower your weapon," Captain Halloway ordered, his eyes scanning the document. "It is a forgery," Crowell yelled, sweat cutting tracks through the soot on his face. "It says here," Halloway read, his voice cold and hard, "that the valley is prone to flash floods that would wash out any track laid within 5 years. It says the land is worthless for the railroad." He looked up at Crowell. "It says you knew this. You bought the land cheap to sell it to the government at a premium, knowing the project would fail. You are not building a railroad. Mr. Crowell, you are defrauding the United States Congress." The soldiers murmured. Defrauding the government was a crime far worse than killing Indians in the eyes of the army. "And," Lillian added, pointing a shaking finger at Crowell, "he hired the men who robbed the supply train, to create a panic, to get you here to kill the witnesses." Crowell's hand shook. The gun wavered between Kai and the captain. He was a cornered rat, and he knew it. I am a patriot," Crowell stammered. "I am bringing civilization." "You are a thief," Kai said, stepping up beside Lillian. He put his hand on her shoulder. A united front. "Arrest him," Captain Halloway ordered his sergeant. Crowell snarled. He jerked the reins of his horse, spinning it around, and dug his spurs into the animal's flanks. He tried to bolt toward the tree line, but his horse was tired, and the ground was slick with ash. The beast stumbled. Crowell was thrown from the saddle. He landed hard in the mud, his gun flying from his hand. Before he could rise, 3 cavalrymen were on him. They dragged him up, his expensive suit coated in the mud of the land he tried to steal. "Ezra Crowell," Halloway said, looking down from his horse, "you are under arrest for fraud, incitement of violence, and attempted murder." Crowell looked at Lillian. His eyes were full of hate. You nothing. You are just a seamstress." Lillian stood tall, her hand gripping Kai's, her other hand holding Juniper close to her leg. "I am a mother," she said, "and you are done." The sun began to set, painting the smoke-filled sky a bruised purple. The fire was dying down, contained by the river and the cliffs. The soldiers and the warriors were working together, beating out the last of the hot spots. It was a strange sight, blue uniforms and buckskins side by side, united by the exhaustion of survival. A large section of the valley was black and scarred. The grass was gone. The trees were skeletons. Kai stood by the river, looking at the blackened earth. Lillian walked up to him. She washed the soot from her face with a wet cloth, but the smell of smoke would stay in her skin for days. "It is gone," Kai said softly. "The grazing land, the winter shelter, it is ruined." "The grass will grow back," Lillian said, touching his arm. "The roots are deep." "It will take years," Kai said, "but we are alive." He turned to look at her. He looked at her burned dress, her bruised hands, the fierce set of her jaw. He saw the woman who had walked into fire for his daughter. He saw the woman who had stared down a gun for him. "You saved us," he said. "We saved each other," Lillian whispered. Kai reached out and took her hand. He interlaced his fingers with hers, bringing her knuckles to his lips. He kissed her soot-stained skin with a reverence that made her knees weak. "Justice has a price," he murmured against her hand. "Yes," Lillian agreed, looking at the charred valley. "But today, we paid it, and we bought it tomorrow." Behind them, Juniper sat on a rock, wrapped in a soldier's blanket, watching them. She smiled, a small, tired smile. The fire had taken much, but it had forged something unbreakable in the ashes. The family she had drawn in chalk was no longer a dream. It was standing right there, battered, burned, and breathing. The dawn that followed the fire did not bring the usual golden light of the New Mexico territory. Instead, the sun rose as a pale, bloodshot eye peering through a shroud of gray haze. The valley, once a vibrant tapestry of green willow and silver sage, was now a scar of charcoal and ash. The air tasted of soot, a bitter grit that coated the tongue and stung the eyes. Kai Redhawk stood amidst the blackened skeletons of the pine trees near the riverbank. The heat had finally dissipated, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy. The women and children were slowly descending from the limestone caves, their faces streaked with grime, their eyes wide as they surveyed the ruin of their winter home. They moved like ghosts in the mist, touching the scorched earth with trembling hands. It was a victory, Kai told himself. The land still belonged to them. Ezra Crowell was in irons, riding north to Santa Fe under heavy guard. But as Kai looked at the wrapped bodies of two young warriors, boys who had stood on the ridge to hold the fire line and had been overcome by the smoke, the victory tasted like ash. The funeral drums began at noon. It was a slow, rhythmic beating that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The tribe gathered in a circle near the water. The only green place left, White Crane, the elder, chanted the songs of passing, his voice cracking with age and smoke. Kai stood apart, watching. He felt the weight of every life under his protection. He had saved the many, but he had lost the few. The guilt was a stone in his gut. He had walked the path of the white man's scout to buy food, and in doing so, he had led the wolf to the door. He questioned if he was a hero or merely a man who had delayed the inevitable. Lillian Hart stood beside him. She had not returned to town. She wore a borrowed blanket over her ruined dress, her hair braided by one of the tribal mothers. She did not speak, but her presence was a steady warmth against the chill of his despair. She watched the smoke of the funeral pyre rise to join the haze of the sky, and she understood the cost of survival. "They fought for a home," Lillian whispered, her voice rough from the smoke. "They died because I was not fast enough," Kai replied, his eyes fixed on the fire. "They died because men like Crowell exist," Lillian corrected him gently but firmly. "Do not take the sins of the greedy upon your own shoulders. Kai, you are strong, but you are not Atlas." Lillian looked down at her own hands. They were scratched and stained. No longer the soft, pale hands of a seamstress who hid indoors. She thought of her husband, the deputy marshal. For years, she had told herself that she was innocent of his crimes because she had never held the gun. She had cooked his meals and washed his shirts and looked away when he came home with blood on his boots. She realized now that her silence had been a permission slip. By saying nothing, she had allowed the darkness to grow. She looked at the charred valley and saw the physical manifestation of years of looking away. "I will not be silent again," she vowed, the words barely audible but ringing with the force of a scream in her mind. "I will not hide in my shop and pretend the world is just what I see through my window." Later that afternoon, Captain Halloway rode back to the edge of the valley. He looked out of place in the somber gathering, his blue uniform a stark contrast to the buckskins and blankets. He dismounted and approached Kai and Lillian. "The prisoner has been secured," Halloway said, removing his hat. "He will face a federal judge in 2 weeks. The charges are extensive: fraud against the government, incitement to riot, attempted murder. His assets have been frozen." "And the land?" Kai asked, his body tense. "I have sent a telegraph to the Department of the Interior," Halloway said, pulling a folded paper from his tunic. "Based on the original survey, Mrs. Hart provided, and the evidence of the flash fire hazard, the Railway Commission has already suspended the spur project. They are moving the line 30 miles south." He handed the paper to Kai. "This valley is recognized as disputed territory under temporary federal protection. It is not a treaty one, Red Hawk, but it is a shield. For now. For now is all we ever have," Kai said, taking the paper. "Mrs. Hart," Halloway turned to Lillian, "you risked a great deal. The town is conflicted, but the law is on your side. The law is a tool." "Captain," Lillian said, meeting his gaze evenly, "it depends entirely on whose hand holds the hammer. I am glad you decided to pick it up." Halloway smiled, a tired, genuine expression. "You are a formidable woman, Lillian Hart. I would not want to be the man who crosses you." He mounted his horse and saluted as he rode away, the dust settling behind him. Lillian felt a strange sensation. It was the feeling of her own spine straightening, of the iron corset of fear finally snapping open. 3 days later, the air in Dust Creek had cleared, but the atmosphere remained heavy. When Lillian returned to open her shop, the bell above the door rang with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet street. She expected rocks through her window. She expected graffiti on her door. Instead, she found a basket of apples on her porch. There was no note. The town was waking up from a fever dream. For months, they had let Ezra Crowell feed them fear and greed. They had believed his lies because it was easier than facing their own poverty. Now, with Crowell in chains and the truth of his swindles exposed, how he had cheated the miners on their script, how he had foreclosed on widows to buy land for a railroad that couldn't be built, shame hung over Dust Creek like a low cloud. Mrs. Higgins, the gossip who had once warned Lillian about her reputation, was the first to enter the shop. She held a bolt of fabric Lillian had ordered weeks ago. "Lillian," Mrs. Higgins said, not meeting her eyes. We heard about the fire, and the girl." "Juniper is safe," Lillian said, measuring the cloth on the counter. "She is recovering." "That is good," Mrs. Higgins said. She hesitated, twisting her purse strings. The ladies of the auxiliary, we were wrong about Crowell and about other things." It was a clumsy apology, half-formed and reluctant, but it was a start. Lillian looked at the woman and saw not an enemy, but a neighbor who had been afraid. "Thank you, Martha," Lillian said. "We were all afraid." That Sunday, the church bell rang. It was not just for the white congregation. The Reverend, a man who had often preached against the heathen, had walked to the edge of the reservation camp and invited them. They came. Not all of them, but enough. Kai walked in, wearing his best buckskins, holding Juniper's hand. Lillian walked beside them. They sat in the back pew. The air in the church was stiff, filled with the tension of people who had spent years looking down gun barrels at each other. But as the Reverend spoke of fire and renewal, of the valley that belonged to God and not to men, heads bowed together. It was not perfect. There were still cold stares. There were men who spat on the ground when Kai walked out. But for the first time, the town acknowledged that the people of the valley were part of the same story. Juniper sat on the edge of the cot in Lillian's back room, coughing into a handkerchief. The smoke had irritated her lungs, leaving her with a rasping cough that kept Lillian awake at night with worry. But it was not the cough that frightened the child. She watched Lillian folding laundry. She watched Kai repairing the blackened railing of the back porch. Her eyes darted between them, frantic and possessive. "Drink this. Sweet," Lillian said, offering a cup of tea with honey and lemon. Juniper took the cup but grabbed Lillian's wrist with her other hand. "Are you going to send us away now?" Lillian sat down, shocked. "Send you away? Why would I do that?" "The fire is out," Juniper whispered. "The bad man is gone. Papa says warriors move on when the battle is done." Lillian looked through the window at Kai. He was working with a fierce intensity, as if he were trying to build a wall against his own thoughts. "Your papa is a man of honor," Lillian said carefully. "But he is also a man who loves you very much." That night, after Lillian had tucked her in, Juniper slipped out of bed. She padded barefoot to the porch where Kai was smoking a pipe, looking at the stars. "Papa." Kai turned, swooping her up into his arms. "You should be sleeping, little bird." "Are you going to leave?" Juniper asked, burying her face in his neck. Like the wind. It was a question she had asked 1,000 times in her short life. Usually, Kai would tell her a story about the hawk that must fly to see the world. But tonight, the story stuck in his throat. He looked at the shop. He looked at the woman moving inside, her silhouette cast against the curtain by the lamplight. He felt the pull of the open plains, the ancient urge to roam that was in his blood. But he also felt the warmth of the small body in his arms, and the terrifying, wonderful pull of the woman inside. "The wind blows. Juniper," Kai said softly, "but the mountain stays. Perhaps I am tired of the wind." The river was a mirror of the night sky, reflecting the vast, indifferent universe above. Kai and Lillian sat on a fallen log near the water's edge, a mile from town. The frogs were singing, a chaotic choir that underscored the silence between them. It had been a week since the fire. They had worked side by side to repair the shop, to help the tribe settle into temporary shelters, to navigate the new, fragile politics of the town, but they had not spoken of the night in the storm. They had not spoken of the kiss on the hand. Kai broke the silence. He picked up a stone and skipped it across the water. 1, 2, 3 jumps before it sank. "The elders spoke to me today," Kai said. "They want me to stay, to be the voice between the tribe and the sadness of the town. They call it the protector of the valley." "That is a high honor," Lillian said, pulling her shawl tighter. "It is a chain," Kai admitted. "It means meetings. It means papers. It means living in one place." He turned to look at her. His face was half in shadow, half in moonlight. "I do not know how to do that, Lillian. I know how to track a deer. I know how to kill a man quietly. I do not know how to sit in a chair and discuss property lines. I do not know how to be domestic." Lillian laughed, a soft, sad sound. "And I spent 2 years being the perfect invisible widow. I sewed straight lines and kept my mouth shut. I do not know how to be the woman who shouts at captains and robs law offices. I do not know how to be a wife to a man who is half-wind." "You are not invisible anymore," Kai said. "You burn brighter than the fire. And you are not just a warrior," Lillian countered. "You are the man who held a blanket over us while the world burned." They looked at each other. The attraction was there, a magnetic pull that was undeniable. But so was the fear. They were 2 damaged people, survivors of different wars, trying to imagine a peace they had never known. "I do not want to be alone anymore," Lillian whispered. It was the bravest thing she had ever said. "I am terrified of it. The silence in that house. It used to be my shield. Now it feels like a coffin." Kai reached out and took her hand. His grip was calloused and warm. "I have spent my life sleeping with one eye open. I do not know if I can close both eyes, but when I am with you, the noise in my head stops." "Is that enough?" Lillian asked. "To build a life on?" "It is a start," Kai said. "The town wants you to teach the children, all the children, mine included." "Yes," Lillian smiled. "They asked me this morning. A proper schoolhouse, for Dust Creek and White Elk." "A bridge," Kai murmured. We are both bridges now. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. They breathed in the same rhythm. It was not a promise of happiness ever after. It was an acknowledgement of the work to come. I will not go north, Kai said. I will stay. I will try to be this protector. And I will teach, Lillian said. And I will not let you be the wind. The night was deep when they returned to the shop. Lillian went inside, the bell chiming softly. Kai stayed on the porch. He stood there for a long time. He looked at the door. It was a sturdy door of oak and iron. Behind it lay warmth. A woman who looked at him as if he were a king, and a daughter who needed a mother. Behind him lay the vast, dark expanse of the territory, the freedom he had always cherished, the ability to ride away and never look back. He raised his hand to knock. He wanted to go in. He wanted to lay his weapons down and rest, but the habit of a lifetime was a heavy coat to take off. He lowered his hand. He stepped back. Not tonight, the voice of the scout whispered in his ear. Tonight, you are still dangerous. Tonight, you are still restless. Do not bring the wild into her house until you are sure you can tame it. He turned and walked away, toward the shed where he slept. He moved silently, like a shadow. Inside the shop, in the darkness of the front room, a small figure stood by the window. Juniper clutched the rag doll Lillian had made for her, a doll with a white dress and black yarn hair. She watched her father walk away from the door. She saw the hesitation. She saw the turn. Juniper narrowed her eyes. She hugged the doll tighter. You can walk away tonight, Papa, she whispered to the glass. But you are not running. I have seen the way you look at her, and I have seen the way she looks at you. She climbed onto the window seat, settling in to keep watch. I am not letting you go, Juniper vowed. I finally have a mom, and you need a husband, Miss Lily, even if he is stubborn. She sat there, a small sentinel in the dark, determined to force the happy ending that the adults were too afraid to grab. The war for the valley was over, but the campaign for the family had just begun. The morning sun over Dust Creek did not seem as harsh as it had 6 months ago. It bathed the town in a golden light that felt less like an interrogation and more like a benediction. The dust was still there, of course. It coated the boardwalks and settled on the window ledges. For this was the New Mexico territory. And dust was as certain as death and taxes. But the air had changed. The tension that used to snap like a dry twig at the slightest provocation had softened into a hum of cautious industry. The sign above the door of Lillian Hart's establishment had been repainted. It now read simply, Hart's School and Stitching. The door stood wide open to the morning breeze. Inside, the room was full. It was not just the sons and daughters of the miners and shopkeepers who sat on the wooden benches. Scattered among them were 5 children from the White Elk tribe, their dark hair shining in the sunlight, their buckskin clothes sitting in stark contrast to the calico and denim of the town children. Lillian stood at the chalkboard, a piece of chalk in her hand. She wore a dress of pale blue, a color she had not dared to wear since she was a girl. It was the color of the sky after a storm, and it suited her. Who can tell me the word for this? Lillian asked, drawing a crude picture of a flowing line on the board. River, shouted Thomas. The baker's son. And in the tongue of the valley? Lillian asked, looking toward the back of the room. A small boy from the tribe hesitated, looking shyly at his feet. Juniper, sitting in the front row with a slate on her lap, turned around in her seat. She was no longer the frightened creature hiding behind a curtain. She was the captain of this small ship. Tell him, little bear, Juniper encouraged him in English, then switched effortlessly to the guttural, flowing language of her father's people. Do not be afraid. It is just a word. The boy looked up, emboldened by her smile. Tuya, he said clearly. River, the class repeated in unison. Lillian smiled. It was a small thing, this exchange of words. It would not erase the years of blood and gunpowder, but it was a seed. And seeds, if watered, had a way of cracking even the hardest stone. Outside, the rhythmic clop of hooves on packed earth drew Lillian's attention. She did not flinch as she once would have. She simply turned to the window. Kai Redhawk was riding into town. He rode his paint horse with a loose rein, his posture relaxed. He wore a clean linen shirt tucked into his trousers. Though his moccasins and the knife at his belt remained, he was not riding as a scout for the army, nor as a fugitive running for his life. He was riding as a man who had business to attend to. As he passed the general store, the blacksmith looked up from his anvil. 6 months ago, the blacksmith would have spat on the ground. Today, he merely wiped his brow and gave a curt, respectful nod. Kai returned the gesture. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was civility. And in the Wild West, civility was the first step toward peace. Papa Juniper was out of her seat before Lillian could give permission. She bolted through the open door, her laughter trailing behind her like a ribbon. Kai swung down from his saddle with a grace that still made Lillian's breath catch in her throat. He caught his daughter in midair, swinging her around until she shrieked with delight. "You are late," Juniper scolded him, though she was beaming. "We are doing geography. You promised to show Thomas how to read a trail map." "A warrior arrives exactly when he means to," Kai said, his voice deep and rumbling like distant thunder. He set her down and looked up at the porch. Lillian stood there, wiping chalk dust from her hands. Her heart did exactly what it had done the first time she saw him. It hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. But she did not look away. She did not hide. "Mr. Redhawk," Lillian said, a teasing lilt in her voice. "You are interrupting my lesson." "I bring supplies," Kai said, gesturing to the saddlebags on his horse. "Pencils from Santa Fe, and paper." "Then you are forgiven," Lillian said. She walked down the steps. They stood close to each other in the middle of the street, surrounded by the noise of the town, yet entirely alone in their own quiet orbit. "Welcome home, Kai," she whispered. Kai looked at her, his dark eyes softening. "It is good to be back, Lillian." During the midday recess, while the children played tag in the dusty lot behind the livery stable, Juniper orchestrated her final maneuver. She took Kai by one hand and Lillian by the other. She marched them behind the shop, to a small patch of grass where a wooden bench sat under the shade of a lone cottonwood tree. It was a private spot, hidden from the prying eyes of the main street, overlooking the distant rise of the hills. "Sit," Juniper commanded. Kai sat. Lillian sat beside him. They were close enough that their shoulders brushed, sending a warm current of awareness through them both. Juniper stood before them, her hands clasped behind her back, rocking on her heels. She looked at Kai, the warrior who had learned to stay. She looked at Lillian, the widow who had learned to fight. "You know," Juniper said, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that was loud enough for a blind man to hear. "The roof is fixed, the fence is painted, the school is full." "Yes, little bird," Kai said patiently. "We have done good work." Juniper shook her head, sighing as if dealing with particularly slow students. She stepped closer, leaning in until her face was level with theirs. "But the house is still too quiet at night," she said. She looked directly at Lillian, then at Kai, her hazel eyes dancing with mischief and a profound, ancient wisdom. "Now you have a husband waiting," she whispered, pointing at Kai. "And I finally have a mom." The silence that followed was absolute. Lillian felt the heat rush to her face, turning her cheeks the color of a desert sunset. She looked down at her hands, her heart racing. Beside her, Kai made a sound she had never heard before. It started low in his chest and bubbled up until he threw his head back. He laughed. It was a rich, deep, joyous sound that transformed his face. The stoic mask of the scout shattered, revealing the man beneath a man capable of light, a man capable of joy. "She has us cornered, Lillian," Kai said, his laughter fading into a warm smile. "There is no escape." Lillian looked up at him. "She is a very persistent negotiator. She takes after her father." Kai turned on the bench to face her fully. He did not get down on one knee. That was not his way. He was a man who stood eye to eye with the world. He simply took both of her hands in his thumbs tracing the rough skin of her knuckles, hands that had stitched wounds and thrown burning lamps for him. "I am not a rich man, Lillian," Kai said, his voice steady and serious. "I have no gold mines, I have no cattle herds. The only land I claim is the valley, and that belongs to the tribe, not to me." "I do not need gold," Lillian said softly. "I know," Kai continued, "but I have found a spot, on the rise of the hill, facing west. It sees the smoke of the tribe's fires in the valley, and it sees the lights of Dust Creek. It is halfway between. I want to build a house there, of stone and timber, a house that will not burn." He squeezed her hands. "I want to build it for Juniper, so she never has to choose between her bloods, and I want to build it for you, so you never have to be invisible again." Lillian looked into his eyes and saw the future there. It was not a fairy tale. It would be hard work. There would be droughts and hard winters and people who would never accept them. But she saw safety. She saw respect. She saw love. "I do not need a perfect husband, Kai," Lillian said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I do not need a man who knows which fork to use at a fancy dinner. I just need a man who will not leave when the storm comes." Kai leaned his forehead against hers. "Lillian," he whispered, "the storm is where I have lived my whole life. I am tired of the wind. I want to learn how to be still. I want to learn how to stay quiet after the storm." "Then stay," Lillian whispered. "Stay with me, always." Kai vowed. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not the desperate, adrenaline-fueled connection of the cave or the fire. It was slow. It was deliberate. It was a seal on a contract written in the heart. Juniper, watching them, nodded with satisfaction. She picked up her slate and walked back toward the schoolhouse, leaving the adults to their moment. "Finally," she muttered to herself. "Grown-ups are so slow." The wedding took place 3 weeks later, on a day when the sky was a piercing, impossible blue. It was not a traditional wedding, but then, nothing about them was traditional. They stood in the open air, in the meadow halfway between the town and the valley entrance. Half the guests arrived in buggies and on horseback from Dust Creek. The women wore their Sunday bonnets, and the men wore stiff collars. The other half walked up from the valley, wearing soft leather and beadwork, the feathers in their hair catching the wind. The Reverend stood on one side of the couple, holding his Bible. White Crane, the tribal elder, stood on the other, holding a fan of eagle feathers and a bowl of burning sage. Lillian wore a simple dress of white cotton, unadorned except for the lace at the collar. Her hair was loose, blowing in the breeze. Juniper had woven wildflowers into a crown that sat upon Lillian's head, bluebells and Indian paintbrush, the colors of the two worlds. Kai stood tall in a new tunic of soft buckskin, but around his neck he wore a simple silver cross that Lillian had given him, hanging beside the turquoise amulet of his ancestors. The Reverend read from the Corinthians about love being patient and kind. White Crane chanted a blessing to the 4 directions, asking the earth to hold them and the sky to watch over them. When the moment came, they did not exchange gold rings. Kai took a strip of leather and tied it around Lillian's wrist, binding her to him. Lillian took a silver band she had forged from a coin and placed it on his finger. "With this ring," Lillian said, her voice clear and carrying over the crowd, "I take thee." "With this life," Kai answered, "I protect thee." When they kissed, a cheer went up that sounded like nothing Dust Creek had ever heard. It was a mixture of cowboy whoops and tribal trills, a discordant, beautiful harmony. Juniper danced in circles around them, throwing flower petals into the air, laughing until she was breathless. For a moment, just a moment, the divide was gone. There was no white, no red. They were just neighbors, witnessing the union of 2 people who had survived the fire. The house on the hill was not finished yet, so they spent their first night as man and wife in the small rooms behind the shop. Lillian had sent Juniper to stay with Mrs. Higgins for the night, a concession to privacy that made her blush when she asked. Now, the door was locked. The curtains were drawn. A small fire crackled in the stove, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. Lillian stood by the bed, her hands trembling as she unbuttoned her cuffs. She felt a sudden surge of old fear, the memory of a husband who took what he wanted, who made intimacy feel like a theft. Kai saw the tremor. He moved across the room, not like a hunter stalking prey, but like a man approaching a frightened deer. He stopped an arm's length away. He did not touch her. "Lillian," he said softly, "look at me." She looked up. His eyes were dark and warm, filled with infinite patience. "I am not him," Kai said, reading her mind as easily as he read a trail. "I am Kai. I am the man who fixed your roof. I am the man who holds your hand." Lillian let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "I know. We have all the time in the world," Kai said. "There is no rush." He reached out and took her hand, bringing it to his chest so she could feel his heart beating. It was steady, strong. "Show me how to love you," he whispered. "Show me how to be the husband you need." Lillian stepped closer. She reached up and untied the leather thong that held his hair back. "Just be here," she whispered. "Just be you." The night that followed was not a storm. It was a slow, gentle rain after a long drought. It was a series of quiet discoveries. Lillian learned the map of his scars with her fingertips, kissing the jagged line of the saber wound, healing the history of violence with tenderness. Kai learned the softness of her skin, treating her body not as territory to be conquered, but as a sanctuary to be worshipped. There was no fear. There was only the sound of their breathing, the warmth of skin on skin, and the profound relief of two lonely people finally laying down their burdens. When the moon rose high, shining through the window, it illuminated two figures tangled together under the quilt, asleep in each other's arms. Outside, the wind blew across the plains, but inside, everything was still. The seasons turned. The summer heat gave way to the golden light of autumn, and then to the biting cold of winter. The house on the hill was finished before the first snow fell. It was a sturdy place, with a wide porch that looked out over the valley. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a signal fire that could be seen from the town and the reservation alike. Kai Redhawk took his role as protector seriously. He rode between the council fires and the mayor's office, translating grievances, settling disputes over water rights and grazing lines. He was a man of two worlds, often tired, often frustrated, but never wavering. He was the knot that held the rope together. Lillian continued to teach. Her schoolhouse expanded. She taught reading and writing, but she also taught history, the true history, the one that included both the pioneers and the people who were here before them. She sewed clothes for the winter, coats for the tribal elders, and dresses for the miners' daughters, stitching the community together one thread at a time, and Juniper grew like a sunflower. She rode her pony between the town and the valley with the confidence of a queen. She no longer asked where she belonged. She knew she belonged everywhere. She was the girl who could track a rabbit and recite Shakespeare. She was the leader of the games, the one who taught the white children how to listen to the wind and the tribal children how to play hopscotch. Dust Creek was still a hard place. There were still saloon brawls and sandstorms. There were still men who muttered slurs when they drank too much. The world did not change overnight, but in the house on the hill, there was safety. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of purple and gold, Kai stood on his porch, smoking his pipe. He watched the lights of the town flicker on, one by one. Lillian stepped out beside him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She leaned against him, and his arm came around her waist automatically, a reflex of love. "It is a good night," Lillian murmured. "The wind is quiet." Kai agreed. Down in the yard, Juniper was chasing fireflies, her laughter ringing like a silver bell in the twilight. "Do you miss it?" Lillian asked quietly. The wandering Kai looked at the horizon, at the endless miles of empty land where he had once ridden alone. Then he looked down at the woman beside him, and at the child running in the grass. "A man wanders to find something," Kai said, kissing the top of her head. "I have found it. Why would I keep looking, narrator? And so, the story of the warrior, the widow, and the child between worlds became a legend in the high desert. It was not a story of gunslingers or gold, but a quieter, more enduring kind of tale. It was a testament that even in the harshest lands, love can take root in the cracks of the stone. They built a life not by forgetting who they were, but by choosing who they wanted to be. They proved that blood does not make a family, courage does. Sometimes, the Wild West is not just a place where bullets fly and men die for glory. Sometimes, it is a place where lost hearts, battered by the storms of life, finally find the path that leads them home. Author's note to the audience. Thank you for listening to the final chapter of You Need a Husband, and I Just Want a Mom. It has been a long journey from the lonely shop in Dust Creek to the house on the hill, and I am grateful you rode along with us. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Are you tuning in from a busy city, or perhaps somewhere quiet like Lillian's Valley? Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on Kai and Lillian's ending. If this story of found family and healing touched your heart, please consider subscribing to Wild West Tales. Give this video a like. And if you really enjoyed it, hit that hype button to help these stories reach more listeners. Your support keeps the spirit of the West alive. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open.